She stepped off that stagecoach carrying nothing but a carpet bag and 31 years of being told she wasn't enough. The rancher who sent for her took one look and turned away. The town laughed. Even the wind seemed to push her back toward the coach. But Eleanor Vane didn't move. What happened next in that broken-down Colorado cattle town would change everything. For one stubborn rancher, for an entire frontier community, and for a woman who had stopped believing she deserved anything good. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach came in late. It always did on the mountain route from Denver. The roads up through the passes were brutal in October. Half-frozen mud that grabbed at wheels and wore horses down to exhaustion before they ever saw the valley. The driver, a gray-bearded man named Pudge, who had been running this particular route for 11 years, once said that the stretch between Copper Ridge and Black Hollow was the kind of road that made men question their choices in life. He wasn't wrong. By the time the coach rattled down the main street of Black Hollow just after 4 in the afternoon, the light was already going thin and pale over the mountains. Autumn in the Colorado Territory didn't ease its way into winter. It arrived like a creditor, sudden and without sympathy, stripping the aspen trees and turning the high pastures from gold to brown almost overnight. The town itself was not much to look at. Black Hollow had started the way most frontier towns did, as a supply stop for miners working the silver veins higher in the mountains, a collection of hasty buildings thrown up around a single muddy road, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a post office that doubled as the barber shop. Over 20 years, it had grown into something more permanent, but not necessarily more dignified. There were families now, a church, a schoolhouse, with 21 students and one exhausted teacher. There was a hotel that leaked in 3 rooms and a restaurant that served the same 2 meals regardless of what you ordered. There were fences and vegetable gardens and a small lending library that the minister's wife, Beatrice Hollowell, maintained with the fierce dedication of a woman who had very few ways to feel civilized this far from anywhere. People stayed in Black Hollow because the land around it was good for cattle, because the winters were survivable if you prepared right, and because leaving required resources most of them no longer had. It was not a cruel town. It was not a kind one either. It was simply a town shaped by hard work and harder weather, populated by people who had learned not to expect too much, and to regard anything unexpected with suspicion. So when the stagecoach stopped and the door swung open, the handful of people gathered near the post office and the general store did what people in small, isolated towns always do. They watched. The first thing Eleanor Vane noticed about Black Hollow was the smell. Even inside the coach, even through the leather curtains she'd kept half drawn for most of the 6-hour ride to keep the dust out of her face, she could smell it. Wood smoke, livestock, pine resin, and underneath all of that, something harder to name. Something like old effort, like the accumulated exhaustion of people who worked from before light until after dark and went to bed knowing they'd do the same thing again tomorrow. She had grown up with that smell. She knew exactly what it meant. Eleanor sat for a moment after the other passengers climbed out. A mining equipment salesman and a young couple going to join family in the next town over. She sat and looked at her hands in her lap. Rough hands, red at the knuckles from years of cold water and heavy work. The hands of a woman who had cleaned other people's houses, cooked in other people's kitchens, and carried other people's laundry up other people's stairs since she was 14 years old. She was 31 now. She picked up the carpet bag, dark blue fabric worn nearly colorless at the corners, packed with 2 dresses, a wool shawl, a small mirror, a comb, and a leather-bound notebook she'd carried for 8 years without writing more than 40 pages of it. And she stepped down onto the platform. The cold hit her immediately. Not vicious cold, not yet, but the kind with teeth, the kind that promised worse was coming and wanted you to know it early. She straightened her back, adjusted the bag strap on her shoulder, and looked at the street. Several people were looking back at her. A woman in a calico apron standing outside the general store. 2 men leaning against a hitching post who had stopped their conversation mid-sentence. A boy of about 12 sitting on a barrel who was eating an apple and staring with the unself-conscious rudeness only children and very old people could get away with. Eleanor met each look without expression. She had been looked at like this before. The measuring kind of look people gave something they weren't sure had value. She had learned a long time ago that looking away first only confirmed their suspicion. "Miss Vane?" The voice came from her left. She turned. The man standing by the post office was tall, taller than she'd pictured from the brief, formal letter he'd sent. Cole Mercer was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of lean, weathered face that came from years of working outdoors in a climate that had no patience for softness. He was wearing a good coat but practical boots, and his hat was pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he'd forgotten it was there. He was looking at her the same way the others were, but worse, because in his face, along with the measuring look, there was something she recognized immediately and had been bracing herself for since Denver: disappointment. Not the rude, unconcealed kind. Cole Mercer was not a cruel man, and whatever he was feeling, he was making an effort to keep it contained. But Eleanor had spent 31 years being looked at by people who had expected something different, and she knew the particular way a person's expression reorganized itself when reality failed to match what they'd imagined. He had imagined someone else. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady. She'd made sure of that. He crossed to her, removed his hat with a brief, automatic courtesy, and extended his hand. "You made good time." The roads were manageable. She shook his hand. His grip was firm, not aggressive. "Better than I expected for October. They get worse fast." He looked briefly at her carpet bag, then at her face again, and she watched him make some interior decision. The decision to proceed, to be decent about this regardless of what he was feeling. "I've got the wagon. Hotel's letting you a room for tonight. We can talk about the arrangements tomorrow, if that suits." If that suits. Formal words. Distance words. "That suits fine," Eleanor said. The hotel room was small and smelled of kerosene and the previous occupant's hair pomade, but the mattress was adequate and the quilt was thick. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed with her carpet bag on the floor and listened to the town settling into evening around her. The far-off sound of the saloon starting its nightly work. Horses being brought in from the day, someone somewhere hammering something with the kind of determined rhythm that meant they were racing the dark. She didn't sleep well. She hadn't slept well in years, truthfully, but tonight was harder than most. The long ride had left her muscles aching and her thoughts loud in a way that rest couldn't quiet. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought, with the ruthless honesty she'd developed as a matter of survival, about what she'd seen in Cole Mercer's face. She had answered the advertisement in the Denver Morning Telegraph 6 weeks ago after reading it 3 times to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding it. A rancher in Colorado Territory, widowed, seeking a capable woman for marriage and partnership in running a working cattle ranch. The advertisement had been specific in a way most weren't. It asked for someone experienced in domestic management, livestock care, and the practical realities of frontier life. Not someone decorative or fragile or arriving with expensive expectations. Eleanor had written back with equal specificity. She described her work history without embellishment. 15 years of domestic service in 3 different households in Pittsburgh, followed by 2 years managing the kitchen and housekeeping for a mining company's workers' boarding house. She mentioned she could preserve food, tend livestock, manage accounts, and work long hours without complaint. She said she was plain-spoken and not given to dramatics. She did not mention that she was plain. That had perhaps been a tactical error. Cole Mercer's response had been brief and businesslike. He described the ranch, 240 acres, a main house, a barn, 8 ranch hands during the busy seasons, 5 in winter, and confirmed that he was looking for a practical arrangement, not a romantic one. He would provide security and a home. She would manage the domestic side of the operation. If they found they could tolerate each other well enough, a proper marriage would follow. If not, he would arrange her passage back east at his expense. It had seemed reasonable to Eleanor. It had seemed, in the cold language of necessity, like the best offer she was ever likely to get. She turned over in the hotel bed and pulled the quilt tighter. Through the thin wall, she could hear 2 men in the next room arguing about the price of winter feed. Their voices rose and fell and rose again, and eventually one of them laughed, and then they both did. And then it was quiet. "You've survived worse starting points," she told herself. She had. That part was true. It didn't make the ceiling any easier to look at. Cole drove her out to the ranch the next morning. The wagon ride took 40 minutes, following a road that climbed gradually out of the valley and into the foothills, moving through stands of pine and aspen before opening onto the high meadows where the Mercer cattle spread out across the grass in slow, grazing groups. Eleanor watched them from the wagon seat, counting automatically, a habit from the boarding house where you were always accounting for things, always measuring what you had against what you needed. She counted 63 head in the meadow to the east. That was a reasonable number for a ranch this size, maybe slightly low for peak season, but not alarming. Cole drove with his eyes on the road, his jaw set in a line that suggested he was either thinking hard about something or actively trying not to say whatever was in his head. The morning was overcast, low clouds sitting on the mountain peaks and smelling like snow that wasn't ready to fall yet. "How long have you had the ranch?" Eleanor asked, because the silence was the kind that would curdle if she let it sit too long. "My father built the main house in '58, Cole said. "I took over in '71 when he passed. Expanded the herd in '74 and '75 before the prices got bad." "Are the prices better now?" He glanced at her briefly. "Some. Better than 3 years ago." A pause. "You know about cattle prices?" "I know about supply and markets generally. I spent 2 years in a mining boarding house managing accounts. The principles aren't entirely different." He didn't respond to that. Whether it impressed him or unsettled him, she couldn't tell. The ranch house came into view as they rounded a bend in the road, and Eleanor's first thought was that it had once been a good house and wanted to be again. The structure itself was solid. Good timber, good stonework on the chimney and foundation, built by someone who knew what they were doing and expected it to last. But the years since Cole's wife had died, she'd gathered from the advertisement it had been approximately 3 years, had done what neglect always does to a house. The kitchen garden was a ruin of dead stalks and matted weeds. The porch railing on the south side had come half loose. The curtains in the front windows were gray with dust. One of the shutters on the upper floor hung at an angle that suggested it had been fighting gravity for some time and was losing. It was a house that had given up on itself. Eleanor recognized the feeling. "It needs work," Cole said, and his voice had something in it, a kind of flat acknowledgement that walked the line between honesty and apology. "Most things worth having do," Eleanor said. The ranch hands were at work in the yard when the wagon pulled in, 4 of them visible, moving between the barn and the outbuildings with the organized bustle of a working morning. They stopped when Cole drove in. They looked at Eleanor the way men at a working ranch always look at a woman who arrives in a position of uncertain authority, careful assessment, frank curiosity, a measuring that was different from the town's measuring, but equally pointed. One of them, a lean man in his late 20s with red hair and a grin that stopped just short of something rude, put both hands on his hips and watched Cole help Eleanor down from the wagon with an expression that said, louder than words, "So this is what he came up with." Cole caught the look. His face went stiff. "Red, you've got the south fence line to finish before noon." "Yes, boss." The grin didn't move. Eleanor looked at Red directly, without hostility and without apology, for exactly the length of time it took him to understand that she had seen the look and filed it away. His grin shifted slightly, just slightly. She picked up her carpet bag and followed Cole into the house. Tits. The kitchen was the worst room. Eleanor stood in the middle of it for a long moment after Cole showed her through, taking stock with the same methodical attention she'd learned to apply to unfamiliar domestic situations. It was a large kitchen, a genuine ranch kitchen, not a city kitchen, with a wide cast-iron range that could handle serious cooking, a good-sized work table, shelves along 2 walls, and a deep sink with a hand pump. The bones were right. Someone had set this kitchen up properly, once knowing what they were doing. But it had been used carelessly for years now. Grease had built up on the range and the wall behind it. The shelves were disorganized, provisions stored without system. A half-empty flour sack sitting next to a tin of axle grease with the lid off, which told her everything about the current state of organization in this house. The sink smelled. There were mouse droppings in the corner by the flour barrel. A pot on the stove had been soaked in water and then abandoned so that it now held a pale, foul-smelling inch of old water and rust. It smelled in there, not filthy exactly, but stale. The smell of loneliness and absence. The smell of meals made without care. The smell of a space no one bothered to respect because there was no one left who remembered what it had been. "The last cook left in July," Cole said from the doorway. He was watching her look at the room with the careful expression of someone waiting for judgment. "She said the work was too isolated. The men have been doing for themselves since then." "I can see that." "It's not He stopped. Started again. I know it's not what you'd expect. Eleanor turned to face him. Mr. Mercer. I answered an advertisement for a working ranch partnership. I didn't expect comfortable. He looked at her for a moment. He seemed like a man trying to figure out whether he was being told something straightforward or something with sharper edges underneath. No, he said finally. I suppose you didn't. Is there anything left worth cooking for supper tonight, or should I take stock before I commit to an answer? He blinked. Yes, there should be. Pantries through there? Eleanor found half a beef roast in the cold pantry, slightly past its best, but still salvageable if treated right. Dried beans, onions that needed using soon, a string of garlic that was mostly still good, preserved tomatoes, dried herbs in jars that had been sitting long enough that their labels were faded but their contents still had smell. A few potatoes with the optimistic beginnings of shoots on them. Not much. Enough. She carried what she needed back to the kitchen, set it on the work table, and looked at the terrible state of the range. It would need cleaning before she could cook on it properly. The shelves needed organizing. The pot needed throwing out. She picked up the pot first, carried it to the back door, and dropped it in the yard with a clang that echoed off the barn wall. Red, who was passing with a coil of fence wire over his shoulder, stopped and stared at her. Eleanor went back inside without looking at him. Bam! She cleaned the range first, which took most of an hour and turned 2 rags black. While the range heated, she sorted the pantry shelves with the speed of someone who had done this exact task dozens of times in dozens of unfamiliar kitchens. Like items together, oldest forward, anything questionable set aside for later evaluation. She found 3 cans of something that had no label and had swollen at the top, and those went into the yard too. She started the beans soaking. She trimmed the roast and got it going low on the heat with onions and a splash of the vinegar she'd found behind a bottle of boot polish, which told her more about the organizational system of this kitchen than anything else. She was scrubbing the work table when the kitchen door opened, and a short, square-built older man came in with a proprietary air that told her he'd been coming through that door without knocking for quite some time. You the new woman? He said. I'm Eleanor Vane, she said, without stopping scrubbing. You are? He seemed briefly surprised by the question. Hatch. Walt Hatchett. I'm the foreman, Mr. Hatchett. She looked up long enough to assess him, a man in his late 50s, weathered down to something like wire and old leather, with eyes that were cautious and not unkind, genuinely curious rather than hostile. Supper's at 6. The range is running. If any of the men have specific dietary concerns I should know about, now's the time to tell me. He stood there a moment. Billy Kearns can't eat onions, he said, a little stunned. Gives him trouble. I'll set his plate aside before the onions go in. Hatch stood in the doorway another few seconds, and she could see him recalibrating something. You been a cook before? I've been a great many things, Eleanor said. Right now I'm trying to get your work table clean enough to be useful. Was there something else you needed? No, he said. No, I don't suppose so. He left. She went back to scrubbing. By 5 o'clock, the kitchen smelled different. Even Eleanor noticed it. The way a space changes when it's being used properly, when heat and food and intention fill up the corners that cold air and neglect had occupied for too long. The bean stew was thick and dark and smelled of garlic and herbs, and the roast had come apart in long, tender pieces that she'd added back into the pot with the beans and the tomatoes to make something that was more than the sum of what she'd started with. She'd found a surviving sourdough starter in a jar at the back of the coldest pantry shelf. She wasn't sure how it had survived the summer neglect, but it was alive, barely, and she'd fed it with a handful of flour and a splash of water and set it near the warm range, more habit than expectation. She baked what bread she could manage with the flour she had, simple loaves, nothing fancy, done in the cast-iron Dutch oven because she hadn't yet found the proper bread pans. At 6, she banged on the triangle outside the back door with the stick that was hanging there for that purpose. She had set the main table in the ranch house dining room, which she'd also cleared and wiped down in between stirring the pot, and she'd brought out the bench seating from along the wall because there were 7 mouths for supper, including Cole. She set bowls down and put the bread on a wooden board in the middle and poured water from the good pitcher she'd found in the back of a cupboard. The men came in. They were dirty and tired from the day's work, tracking mud, filling the room with the smell of horses and sweat and cold air, and they sat down with the particular joyless efficiency of men who have been feeding themselves out of obligation for several months. Red came in last, scraping his boots with excessive care, and took a seat at the far end of the bench without looking at Eleanor. Cole sat at the head of the table. He looked at the food. Then at Eleanor, who was standing near the doorway because she hadn't decided yet whether she was eating with them or separately. "Sit down," he said. His voice was neutral but not unfriendly. She sat. There was a moment, the kind of moment that happens at a table before anyone commits to the meal, when nobody said anything, and the only sound was the range ticking in the kitchen and wind starting to pick up outside. Then Hatch picked up his spoon and ate. And then the table changed. Eleanor watched it happen the way she'd watched it happen before, in other hard places with other hungry people. The moment when food that has been made with actual care hits someone who has been eating without it. Hatch went still for half a second. Not dramatically, just still. Then he reached for the bread. The man next to him, a big, quiet Norwegian named Eric, who Hatch had introduced briefly as the best horseman on the ranch, followed. Then the others. Red, at the end of the bench, picked up his spoon with the posture of a man determined not to react to anything. He ate. He ate the way someone eats when they are trying not to show that something is better than they expected, which is a very specific performance, and one Eleanor had learned to recognize perfectly. He ate 2 full bowls. He did not look up once. Cole ate steadily and without comment until most of the bread was gone, and then he set his spoon down and looked at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't fully read, something complicated moving under the surface of his face, something he hadn't decided what to do with yet. "It's good," he said finally. It was only 2 words, but in this house, she suspected, from this particular man, those words had probably cost him something. "Thank you," she said. She didn't make it into more than it was. After supper, she went back to the kitchen and cleaned up alone. She could hear the men in the common room, voices, quiet laughter, the particular low rumble of tired men unwinding for the evening. She washed the bowls and the pot and the breadboard and put everything away in the places she'd chosen for them, building the architecture of a working kitchen system from scratch. She was tired. Not the defeated kind of tired she sometimes felt after a long day in someone else's house, serving someone else's life. A different kind, the satisfying exhaustion of effort that had gone somewhere. She heard boots on the kitchen floor behind her and turned. Cole was standing in the doorway. He was holding his coffee mug, which meant he'd come for the coffee pot on the range. She'd kept it going through supper and after. But he didn't immediately reach for it. He stood there for a second with the particular look of a man who has something to say and is making up his mind about whether to say it. "The men haven't eaten like that since—" He stopped. "A while," he finished. Eleanor turned back to the sink. "The pantry needs restocking, particularly on staples. I can make a list tomorrow if you want." "All right." "And someone's been storing engine supplies on the same shelves as the food." "That'd be Red." "Could you ask him not to?" A brief pause. "I'll tell him." She nodded, wringing out the dishcloth. Behind her, she heard him pour his coffee. "Miss Vane." She turned. He was looking at her with that complicated expression again, and this time some of what was in it had come closer to the surface. Not warmth, not yet. They were nowhere near that, but something more honest than what she'd seen on the platform yesterday when he first saw her. "I want to be straight with you," he said. "When I saw you step off the coach yesterday, He stopped again. This was evidently a man who found directness difficult, not because he was dishonest, but because he was unused to saying things out loud that he'd only ever thought to himself. "You thought you'd made a mistake," Eleanor said. He held her gaze. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Did you pay for my passage here?" "I did." "Then you've invested in finding out whether you're right about that. Give it time before you decide." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, nothing so easy as that, but something loosened, just slightly. "That's fair," he said. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." "Good night, Miss Vane." He took his coffee and went. Eleanor turned off the kitchen lamp and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the ranch settle around her. Give it time before you decide. She'd said it to him. She was also saying it to herself. Outside, the first serious wind of the coming winter moved through the pine trees on the hillside, a long, cold sound that pressed against the windows and then moved on. Eleanor picked up her carpet bag from where she'd left it against the wall and went to find which room was hers. The first time Eleanor went into Black Hollow for supplies was on a Thursday, 8 days after she arrived. Cole drove her in himself, which she understood meant something, that he was not yet ready to let her navigate the town alone, or perhaps that he felt some unspoken obligation to appear with her rather than send her in like a hired hand. They drove in mostly silence, the comfortable kind that's different from the tense kind, though Eleanor wasn't certain yet which this was. The general store was run by a man named George Pullman, and more decisively by his wife, Ada Pullman, who had been the de facto information exchange of Black Hollow for 2 decades. Ada was a compact woman in her 50s with sharp eyes behind small spectacles, and the particular manner of someone who had been managing the social complexity of a small community long enough to be direct about it without being rude. She looked at Eleanor the way she probably looked at everything, with the rapid, practiced assessment of someone who catalogs people the same way she cataloged inventory. Cole made the introductions at the counter. Eleanor provided Hatch's supply list. Ada read through it. "You're restocking the ranch kitchen." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Eliza Mercer's kitchen." The name dropped into the conversation with a slight deliberate weight. "I wasn't aware of her name," Eleanor said, because it was the truth. Ada looked at her over the spectacles. Something in Eleanor's directness seemed to recalibrate her slightly. Well, she had good taste in flour. I'll give her that. She turned and began pulling items from the shelves with efficient movements. Cole had gone to the back of the store to look at harness hardware, and Eleanor heard him talking to George Pullman in low tones that had the slightly accelerated quality of 2 people conducting a conversation at a distance from someone they were discussing. She didn't strain to hear it. She made notes on the list of what prices looked like versus what she'd estimated. From the side door that connected the store to the family's living space, Eleanor heard a woman's voice, lower, confident, designed to carry just far enough without being openly loud. "Is that actually her? She looks like a—" And then another woman's voice, quicker, quieter, cutting it off. Ada, behind the counter, kept her eyes on the shelves. Eleanor wrote down the price of flour in the margin of the list. That night, back at the ranch, Hatch told her without preamble that the talk in town was that Cole Mercer had ended up with the wrong woman, and that the marriage arrangement wouldn't survive Christmas. He said it the way he said most things, flat, factual, watching to see how she took it. "Who's predicting Christmas specifically?" Eleanor asked. He blinked. Pardon? Is it a general assumption, or did someone set a specific date?" The corner of his mouth moved. "May Darrow has a habit of being specific." "I don't know May Darrow." "You will," Hatch said. "Everyone does eventually." Eleanor thought about this. "Did you come to tell me because you think I should worry, or because you thought I should know?" Hatch was quiet for a second. He was, she had begun to realize, a man who answered questions accurately when he bothered to consider them. "The second one," he said. "Thank you, then." He nodded and left. Eleanor went back to the accounts she was trying to put in order. Something was happening on the Mercer Ranch that nobody could quite account for. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It came in the way real changes often do, quietly, accumulating in small things until the small things added up to something that couldn't be ignored. The kitchen was clean. This sounds simple, but for a ranch running on tired men and bad organization, a clean and properly stocked kitchen that produced 3 regular meals a day changed the texture of every day in ways that went beyond food. Men who ate well slept better and worked with more patience. Arguments that had flared over minor irritations, the kind that bloom in exhausted, poorly fed men like weeds in dry ground, stopped happening the way they had. Red, who had been testing Eleanor's tolerance with small provocations for the first week, found after the second week that none of them were landing in the way he'd expected. She didn't rise to bait. She didn't complain to Cole. She simply noticed what he did, filed it away, and kept working. He was accustomed to being a minor disruptive force, and it was profoundly disorienting to find that someone had simply declined to let him be one. "She's strange," Red told Eric one evening. "She's efficient," Eric said in his methodical way. "That's what I mean." Eric shrugged with the air of someone who found nothing troubling about efficiency and went back to his harness stitching. Eleanor had also begun working on the kitchen garden, which was the kind of late-season salvage operation that had more to do with preparation for spring than any current harvest. She cleared the dead growth methodically, amended the soil with composted waste from the barn that she'd convinced Hatch to redirect her way, and planted garlic. Garlic being one of the things that could go in cold and come up right in spring with almost no further intervention. Cole watched her doing this from the fence line one afternoon, and he was aware that he was watching her and couldn't entirely justify it. She was not doing anything remarkable. She was digging in cold dirt with a hand trowel, her sleeves pushed up despite the temperature, her hair escaping from its pins the way it always did after she'd been working for a few hours. He'd thought, when she arrived, that his primary feeling about Eleanor Vane was disappointment. He had been trying, in the days since, to locate that feeling precisely, and found that it had shifted into something he couldn't name as cleanly. She was not what he'd pictured, but the woman he'd pictured. Younger, perhaps, softer, easier. In some way he hadn't defined clearly even to himself, wouldn't have walked into that kitchen on the first evening and made supper out of almost nothing. Wouldn't have organized his pantry in a single afternoon, or built a working kitchen system in a week, or handled Red's needling with the quiet authority of someone who had encountered far worse and found it unimpressive. He had written that advertisement in a moment of practical desperation. The ranch was falling behind on everything domestic. The accounts were chaos. He never had time to address. The house had grown into something he barely recognized, and he had found himself more than once that summer sitting at the supper table eating cold beans alone and wondering how things had gotten so far from what they were supposed to be. He'd wanted practical. He'd written for practical. He'd looked at Eleanor Vane stepping off the stagecoach and felt his heart sink because he'd wanted practical, and also, he was honest enough with himself to know this, he'd hoped for something else too, something warmer, something that would make the effort of opening his house and his life to a stranger feel worth the risk. He wasn't sure yet what he had, but it wasn't nothing. He was aware it was not nothing. "You're staying then," Ada Pullman said to Eleanor the following Thursday. Eleanor had come in alone this time. Cole had sent her with the wagon and one of the hands, a quiet young man named James who waited outside with the horses. She was restocking for the week and had a secondary list of household repairs she was pricing. "I'm here until there's a reason to be somewhere else," Eleanor said, which was the most honest answer she had. Ada studied her for a moment. "Eliza, Cole's wife. She was a friend of mine, for what that's worth." Eleanor looked up. She hadn't expected this. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel bad," Ada said. "I'm telling you because people in this town are going to try to make you feel that you've come into someone else's story, that you're temporary, that you don't belong in it." She set a bag of cornmeal on the counter with a small, decisive thud. "Eliza was my friend, and she'd have had no patience for people making life harder for someone who was just trying to do their job." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Ada waved this off. "I'm not being charitable. I'm being accurate. There's a difference." She looked at the list. "You want the good lard or the cheaper one?" "The good one," Eleanor said. "The cheaper one isn't worth what you save on it." Ada smiled for the first time, small and brief, like something she didn't do carelessly. "I'll put it on the Mercer account." The harvest supper had been a Black Hollow tradition for 19 years. The first Friday of November, the church hall, every family in the valley invited. It was the last gathering before the real winter set in, the last chance to eat together in large numbers before the cold and the snow and the isolation of the mountain months closed everything down to the essential. This year, 3 weeks before the event, the woman who had organized it for the past 9 years, Mabel Croft, who ran the most organized household in Black Hollow, and who had the event management instincts of a general, suffered a fall that broke her wrist and her ankle simultaneously, and left her confined to her house with her arm in a sling and her foot elevated, directing her husband Silas in the running of their household with the controlled fury of someone who hates needing help. The town had a problem. There were women capable of cooking for a large crowd. There was no one with Mabel's organizational capacity who was also willing to do it on 3 weeks' notice. The discussion about this at the church on Sunday, which Eleanor had begun attending, not from piety but from pragmatism, because the church was where the social currency of this town was exchanged, and she needed to understand its economy, turned into the kind of circular, escalating, nobody wants to volunteer argument that is universal to small communities facing collective tasks. Eleanor sat in the back pew next to Cole and listened. At a certain point, the minister's wife, Beatrice Hollowell, looked around the room with the particular desperation of a woman watching a problem go unsolved and her own reluctant volunteering getting closer by the minute. Eleanor raised her hand. It was not a large gesture. She didn't stand. She simply put her hand up in the back of the church, in the quiet moment when nobody was talking. Everyone looked at her. She felt the weight of every look in that room. The speculative ones, the skeptical ones, the one from May Darrow that managed to convey an entire editorial in a single expression. "I'll organize it," Eleanor said. The silence that followed had a specific quality. Cole, beside her, was very still. "Miss Vane," Beatrice Hollowell found her voice first, with the slightly overstated warmth of a woman trying to balance genuine surprise with social grace. "That's very generous. I can manage a large supper," Eleanor said, keeping her voice even. "I've done it before. If people are willing to contribute provisions and labor according to a plan, I can have it organized by end of this week." More silence. Then Hatch, who was sitting 3 rows in front with his hat in his hands, said, without turning around, "She can. I've seen what she does with a kitchen." Something shifted in the room. Not much, but something. May Darrow said, audibly enough, "I'm not certain we should trust—" "May," said Ada Pullman from across the aisle, with the 2-syllable finality of a woman closing a subject. May closed it. Beatrice Hollowell looked at Eleanor. "We would be most grateful," she said, and this time the warmth was not performed. Eleanor nodded once and folded her hands in her lap. Cole, beside her, was looking straight ahead, but she could see at the edge of her vision that his jaw had unclenched. She had not done it to impress him, but she noticed anyway. After the gathering, as they walked to the wagon, Cole matched his stride to hers and said, without preamble, "That was either very brave or very foolish." "What's the difference?" Eleanor said. "If it works." He looked at her sideways. "And if it doesn't?" She climbed up onto the wagon seat before answering. "Then I'll know for certain what they think of me. Right now, I only suspect." He stood there for a second, then climbed up on his side and picked up the reins. He clicked his tongue, and the horses moved. They had gone a quarter-mile down the road before he said, quietly, like he was saying it to the horses more than to her, "It's going to work." Eleanor looked at the road ahead. She didn't say anything, but she thought, yes, it is. The cold came in harder that week, and the nights at the ranch turned the kind of dark that pressed against the windows and made the lamplight inside feel precious. Eleanor worked on the harvest supper lists after supper every night at the kitchen table, while the men played cards in the common room, and Cole went over accounts in his study. The house had a rhythm now, irregular and imperfect, and not without friction. Red still had days, but a rhythm. One night she was still at the kitchen table at past 10 when Cole came through for water and found her surrounded by papers. "You should sleep," he said. "I will." She didn't look up. "I'm organizing the cooking schedule so that the heaviest labor falls across 3 days instead of 1. If I try to do everything the day of, something breaks down." He was quiet. She heard him fill his cup at the sink. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Not close, not immediately. He did it the way he did most things, carefully, as though testing the weight of the choice. "Let me see," he said. She looked up. "The schedule," he said. "I can at least tell you what provisions the ranch can contribute. Might save you a trip to Pullman's." Eleanor slid the paper across the table. He studied it. His finger moved down the columns she'd made. Quantities, timing, dependencies, names of women who'd agreed to take specific items. She watched him work through it with the focused attention of someone accustomed to reading plans, and something about the normalcy of it, sitting across a table from him in the lamplight, working together on the same problem, settled in her chest in a way that she didn't examine too closely. "You can have 2 of the steers," he said, setting the paper down. "And the root cellar has more potatoes than that. I'll have Hatch pull what you need." "Thank you." He nodded, stood, looked at the table full of her organized papers, and then at her, and whatever he was thinking moved too fast across his face for her to catch. "Good night, Miss Vane," he said. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." He went. The lamp burned low. Eleanor put her pen down and sat in the quiet kitchen and thought about how far she was from Pittsburgh, from the boarding house, from every room she'd ever been in that she'd had to leave. The sourdough starter was alive and growing in its jar by the range. She looked at it for a long time before she went to bed. The 3 weeks between Eleanor's announcement in the church and the harvest supper were the longest and most complicated of her time in Black Hollow, and not entirely for the reasons she'd expected. The logistics were manageable. She had organized large meals before. The mining boarding house had fed 63 men 3 times a day during peak season, and that operation had required the kind of systematic thinking that made a frontier harvest supper for perhaps 90 people look straightforward by comparison. She built her schedule, assigned her tasks, confirmed her contributors, and worked through the ranch kitchen every evening with the quiet efficiency that had become her natural register. What she hadn't anticipated was how much the announcement had changed the atmosphere around her. Not in the town. The town's opinion was still mixed and in some quarters actively hostile, and she'd made peace with that early. What changed was subtler and closer. It was in the way the ranch hands moved around her, in the way Hatch had spoken her name at the church without being asked, in the way Red, who still had edges and probably always would, had stopped making the specific kind of remark that was designed to remind her of her uncertain position. She had not asked for any of it. That was perhaps why it had come. Eric cornered her by the barn one morning while she was checking the root cellar inventory Cole had offered. He was a man of very few words, and when he used them, they tended to matter. "You need someone to haul wood to the church hall the day before," he said. "I'll do it." Eleanor looked up at him. He was holding his hat and looking somewhere to the left of her face with the slightly pained expression of a man who found direct sincerity physically uncomfortable. "That would help a great deal," she said. "Thank you, Eric." He nodded and put his hat back on and walked away without another word. She stood in the cold morning air and felt something she hadn't felt since she arrived. Not just the practical satisfaction of a task going well, but something warmer and more fragile than that. The particular sensation of being seen by people who had not initially bothered to look. She didn't let herself lean on it. Things that felt fragile had a habit of breaking when you put weight on them. But she didn't dismiss it either. The supper planning required 3 trips to Pullman's general store across the following 2 weeks, and by the second trip, Ada Pullman had stopped treating Eleanor with cautious fairness and started treating her with something closer to genuine regard, which showed itself in small, practical ways. The better quality of the cuts she set aside from the delivery, the way she pulled the requested items before Eleanor arrived, so there was less time standing at the counter to be looked at by the other women who came through. On the third trip, Ada was serving another customer when Eleanor arrived. A woman Eleanor recognized from the church gathering, tall and angular, with the pressed, careful appearance of someone who spent considerable effort on how they presented themselves in public. May Darrow. Eleanor had heard her name enough to know her on sight, though they had not formally spoken. May Darrow looked at Eleanor the way certain people look at things they've decided about in advance. "Mrs. Darrow," Eleanor said, without particular warmth or coldness. May Darrow smiled with her mouth only. "Miss Vane, I hear you've been quite ambitious, taking on Mabel's event." A small pause loaded with cargo. "I do hope you haven't overestimated yourself. Mabel has been doing this for 9 years. She knows what this town expects." Eleanor set her list on the counter. "I expect the town would like hot food and a warm room," she said. "I can manage both." "It's rather more than that. There's a standard—" "May." Ada's voice from behind the shelves was flat and final. May Darrow adjusted her gloves and left. Ada emerged from the shelves carrying a 20-pound flour sack and set it on the counter with unnecessary force. She looked at Eleanor. "Don't take it personally." "I don't," Eleanor said, and meant it. Ada looked at her for a long second. "You know what's funny about you?" she said. "I'm sure you'll tell me. You're not performing not caring. Most people who say they don't care are performing it. You actually just don't." Ada shook her head slightly, not quite disapprovingly. "It's unnerving." "I've been told that before," Eleanor said. "I believe it." She loaded the supplies and drove the wagon back to the ranch in the cold afternoon, and she thought about what Ada had said. It wasn't entirely true. Eleanor cared. She cared quite a lot about a number of things. She just had a practiced discipline about which cares she allowed to be visible, born from years of learning that displaying your wounds in front of people who weren't invested in you was simply handing them a tool. She pulled the wagon into the yard and found Cole at the fence line near the barn, talking with Hatch. He turned when he heard the wheels and watched her pull up with an expression that had been doing something new lately, something she'd started noticing in the past week or so and hadn't decided what to call. It wasn't the careful neutrality of the first week, and it wasn't the managed disappointment of the stagecoach platform. It was something quieter, something that looked at her the way a man looks at something he's been underestimating, when the underestimation has finally become untenable. She climbed down and he came to help with the supply bags without being asked, and neither of them commented on this. "How much more do you need before the supper?" he asked, slinging the heavier bag over his shoulder. "This should do it, plus what comes from the contributing families. I've been accounting for the gap between what people promise and what they actually deliver, so there's margin built in." He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but close enough that Hatch, who was following them to the house with the lighter load, caught it and very carefully looked somewhere else. "Smart," Cole said. "Practical," Eleanor corrected. He held the kitchen door open for her and she walked through it, and neither of them said anything else, but the silence had a different quality than it used to. Hatch, coming through behind them, looked at the ceiling briefly with the expression of a man keeping his mouth shut with concentrated effort. The work for the following days was relentless. Eleanor rose before light and was in the kitchen by the time the ranch hands came in for breakfast. She baked what could be baked ahead, preserved what could be preserved, organized the contributing lists with the obsessive accuracy of someone who understood that the difference between a successful large event and a failed one was almost entirely logistical. She corresponded, by note, delivered by whoever was going into town, with the 4 women who had agreed to bring specific dishes, managing their contributions with a combination of gratitude and quiet firmness that ensured what was promised would actually appear. The contributing women were Beatrice Hollowell, who was bringing a smoked ham and 3 pies, a woman named Carol Jessup, who had a reputation for the best apple preserves in the valley, and who was contributing 6 jars of those plus 2 roasted chickens, a ranching widow named Ida Pierce, who was bringing root vegetable dishes and 2 kinds of bread, and a young woman named Susanna, the blacksmith's wife, who was bringing desserts and seemed to have agreed with the nervous enthusiasm of someone who had not fully thought through the commitment until after she'd made it. Eleanor managed Susanna's anxiety in a series of brief, practical notes that were essentially a gentle tutorial on scaling a dessert recipe, and by the 3rd note, Susanna had written back with something approaching genuine confidence rather than panic. Through all of this, the ranch itself continued to operate, and Eleanor continued to run the domestic side of it with the same unflashy competence that had been rebuilding the place for weeks. She had started keeping proper accounts, a ledger of household expenditure and provisions that she went over every Sunday evening, because the one time she'd attempted to show Cole how much waste there had been in the months without a system, the raw numbers had tightened his jaw in a way that told her he had not previously understood the scale of it. "How is it you can do this?" he'd asked, that evening, looking at her neat columns of figures. "I've had to account for other people's money since I was 15, she said. "You develop habits." "Where?" It was the first time he'd asked directly about her history. She'd been waiting for it, in a way. Not dreading it, but anticipating it. The way you anticipate a conversation you know is coming and have been running versions of in your head. "Pittsburgh, mostly," she said. "Domestic service. Then the mining boarding house in West Virginia for 2 years before I came west." "Family?" She was quiet for a beat. "Mother died when I was 12. Father was not—" She paused, choosing the word the way she chose most of her words, with accuracy rather than drama. "He was not reliable. There were no siblings." Cole was looking at the ledger but not seeing it. "You've been on your own a long time." "Yes." "That's—" He stopped. "You don't need to qualify it," Eleanor said. "I'm not asking for sympathy. It's just what happened." He looked at her then, directly, the way he rarely did for more than a second or two. "I know," he said. "I just—" He stopped again, and she could see him genuinely struggling with something. trying to find the language for a thought that hadn't been put into words before. I think I expected a woman in your position to be, smaller about it, quieter about what she was. Eleanor thought about this. I am quiet, she said. Not that kind of quiet, Cole said. She looked at him. He looked at the ledger. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Get some sleep, Eleanor said finally, closing the ledger. You've got the South Herd to move tomorrow. He pushed back his chair and stood. At the doorway he turned, and she had the sense again of something being considered and then redirected. A thought he started and then thought better of. Good night, Miss Vane, he said instead. Good night, Mr. Mercer. She listened to his footsteps cross the floorboards of the hall and go up the stairs, and she sat alone in the kitchen with the ledger closed under her hands and the lamp burning low, and she did not examine too carefully what she was feeling. That discipline was harder to maintain than it used to be. The Thursday before the Friday harvest supper, Mabel Croft sent a note to the ranch. It arrived with Cole on his return from town, and he handed it to Eleanor at the kitchen table where she was finalizing the cooking schedule. She opened it and read it, and then read it again because the first reading didn't quite resolve into what she expected. Mabel Croft had not written a note of complaint, or of instruction, or of criticism politely wrapped in courtesy. She had written, in the careful handwriting of a woman managing a pen with a sling on her dominant arm, a single paragraph that said, essentially, she had heard from 3 separate people about the plan Eleanor had put in place. She recognized the organization in it because she understood organization, and she wanted Eleanor to know that the smoked sausage her husband Silas was bringing on Friday was her personal contribution, not an official household contribution, which meant Eleanor could do with it what she thought was right for the menu rather than feeling obligated to feature it. It was the most direct form of professional respect Eleanor had received from another woman in Black Hollow. She folded the note and tucked it into her apron pocket. Good news? Cole asked. Adequate news, Eleanor said, and went back to her schedule. But she was not unaffected. She was simply experienced at being unaffected in front of people, which was a different thing entirely. That night after supper, Red lingered at the kitchen table after the others left. This was unusual. Red had been managing a kind of armed détente with Eleanor for 3 weeks. Civil, careful, the specific truce of a man who has been maneuvering and found that his maneuvering has no traction and is trying to figure out what that means about him. Eleanor was washing up at the sink. She heard him not leave and waited. I had a cook on a cattle drive 2 years ago, Red said, to the table rather than to her. Real piece of work. Didn't care about anything except getting through the day. Everything tasted like burnt regret. Eleanor kept washing. That's a specific complaint. Yeah, well. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. My point is it's different here now, since you came. She dried her hands on the cloth and turned around. Red was looking at the table with the slightly pained expression of a man who has said something genuine and is not comfortable with the fact. Thank you, Red, Eleanor said. He stood up quickly, scraping the chair. Don't make it weird, he said, and left. She looked at the empty kitchen. The beginning of a smile crossed her face and then was gone. The morning of the harvest supper arrived cold and clear, with the specific sharp quality of a November morning in the mountains that cuts through every layer of clothing and reminds you that you are a small, warm thing in a very cold world. Eleanor was up at 4. She had the range hot by 4:30 and the first 2 batches of bread in the cast iron by 5. Eric arrived at the ranch at 6 with his wagon already loaded with the firewood she'd asked for, and she sent him ahead to the church hall with the first load of supplies and the instruction to get the hall's large range running as early as possible. Cole found her in the kitchen at 6:30 carrying 2 heavy stockpots to the wagon and took them from her without asking, which was the kind of thing he'd started doing lately, small practical acts of help that arrived without announcement and without any apparent expectation of acknowledgement. I'll drive you in, he said. You have the morning work. Hatch can manage the morning work. He set the pots in the wagon bed and looked at her. I'll drive you in. She looked at him for a moment. The cold morning air was white with their breath. His face had that quiet directness it had when he was not going to be argued with, which had nothing aggressive in it, just a kind of settled certainty. All right, she said. They loaded the wagon in the early dark. working together with the efficiency of people who have learned each other's rhythms, and drove into Black Hollow as the sun was beginning to hit the peaks. The church hall was a long, low timber building behind the church, and when Eleanor arrived, Beatrice Hollowell and Ida Pierce were already there, and Carol Jessup arrived 20 minutes later, and then Susanna appeared carrying 4 covered trays with the triumphant air of someone who has accomplished something they were not certain they could do. The day was organized chaos from the beginning, and Eleanor would not have had it any other way because organized chaos was manageable, and the chaos of disorganization was not. She moved through the hall with her schedule, delegating, redirecting, catching problems before they became disasters. The moment when Susanna's second custard showed signs of breaking and needed rescuing. The discovery that one of the trestle tables had a leg that gave slightly and needed to be weighted at the far end. The question of whether the smoked pork should come out at the same time as the beef or be held back for the later arrivals. Around noon, May Darrow appeared. She came with a covered dish, a casserole from the smell of it, and set it on one of the contribution tables with the careful deliberateness of a woman who is making a point of being cooperative. She looked around the hall, taking in the organized movement, the smell, the tables already laid and waiting, and Eleanor watched her from across the room absorbing what she was seeing. Then May Darrow's gaze found Eleanor and held it for a moment. Eleanor didn't move toward her. She waited. May crossed the hall, stepping carefully around a woman carrying 2 pitchers of cider. She stopped in front of Eleanor with a composure that had something stiff at the edges, like a door that had swollen slightly in its frame. "It looks well organized," May said. The sentence had the quality of a thing that cost something to say. "We've had good help," Eleanor said. May looked at the room again. "Mabel will want a report," she said. "She'll be sorry to have missed it." "I'll send one." Eleanor paused. "The casserole smells good." May blinked. "It's my mother's recipe." The stiffness shifted slightly. "She used to make it for gatherings in Missouri." "Then it'll be welcome," Eleanor said. "Thank you for bringing it." It was not a dramatic moment. Nothing was resolved by it and nothing was transformed. May Darrow was not suddenly a different person, and Eleanor didn't need her to be. But the door had moved slightly in its frame, and that was not nothing. May nodded once, adjusted her coat, and went to speak with Beatrice Hollowell. The supper opened at 6. They came from all the ranches and the homesteads and the shops in town, families with children scrubbed clean for the occasion, men who'd changed into their least worn clothes, widows who'd been looking forward to this gathering since September. The church hall, which in the daylight was merely a practical building, had been transformed over the course of the day into something that deserved the word warm in the full sense of it. Not just in temperature, but in atmosphere, in the yellow lamplight, and the smell of food that had been cooked with care, and the tables lined end to end across the wooden floor. Eleanor stood near the kitchen door as the food was served, not because she needed to supervise anymore, but because she hadn't found a different place to be. She watched the room fill and heard the change in it. The sound of a community dropping its winter armor, the particular noise of hungry people who have been given food that was worth eating, conversations starting and building, children sliding on the floor in the corner while their parents weren't watching, old men who didn't usually talk finding that they were talking. Hatch materialized beside her with a plate of food and held it out. "You haven't eaten." "I was about to." "You were standing by the wall not eating," Hatch said. "Take the plate." She took the plate. He stood next to her for a moment, looking at the room. "You did a hell of a thing here," he said. "We all did it." "Don't do that," he said, without heat. "You organized it. You can take the credit." She ate a piece of bread and looked at the room and let herself have the credit, briefly and quietly, the way she let herself have most good things, carefully, aware that good things were not permanent, but present for them in the moment they existed. Across the hall, she could see Cole talking with a rancher from the north end of the valley, and he looked relaxed in a way she hadn't seen him look before. Relaxed in the deep way that comes when a person feels, for the first time in a while, that things might be all right. He turned his head and found her across the room, and for a second they just looked at each other, and then someone spoke to him, and he turned away, and Eleanor looked at her plate. She ate. The night was going well. It was going, in fact, better than she'd planned for, which was always the most dangerous time, because that was when you stopped watching for what could go wrong. She'd been standing by the kitchen door for perhaps 40 minutes when she first heard it. Not inside the hall. Outside. A low, persistent sound that was different from wind. A heavier sound. A building sound. The kind that starts at the bottom of your awareness and works its way up through it until you can't hear anything else. She set her plate down and walked to the hall's front door and pushed it open. The cold hit her immediately. But it was not the same cold it had been at noon. The sky to the northwest, over the mountain ridgeline, had turned the color of a bruise. Not the pale gray of a regular winter system, but something darker, more urgent, shot through with the particular greenish tinge that old-timers in the mountains had names for, and none of those names were reassuring. The temperature had dropped hard in the past few hours. Dropped in the way temperature drops when something serious is coming, not gradually, but decisively. The wind came in a gust that nearly took Eleanor off the step. She caught the doorframe and looked at the sky for 3 full seconds. Then she went back inside. Cole was already watching her from across the room, and the question on his face showed he'd heard the change in the wind too. Eleanor walked directly to him, which meant crossing the full length of the hall past tables and families and the noise of a good evening, and people watched her do it with the instinctive awareness of a community that understands that a woman walking with that particular kind of purpose is going somewhere that matters. "How bad?" Cole said when she reached him. "Bad," Eleanor said. "Look at the sky northwest and tell me what you see." He crossed to the door and came back in 45 seconds. His face had changed. "That's not a squall," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "How many families here came more than 3 miles?" He looked at the room, calculating. "At least 24, maybe 30. "Then nobody leaves tonight," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "The road back through the pass will be impassable in 2 hours," she said. "Maybe less. If families try to make it home in the dark with that coming—" "I know," he said. He was already looking at the room differently, already shifting into the assessment mode she'd seen him use with the ranch. The capable, practical intelligence of a man who knew how to manage a crisis when he could see it coming. "The hall can shelter maybe half of them comfortably." "The church too," Eleanor said. "And the hotel has rooms, and the saloon has floor space if it comes to it." She was already building the list in her head, the same way she built every list. "We need the fires built up in both buildings. We need to account for children first, get them settled and warm. The food we have should last if we ration it properly. I know exactly what's here and what's in the hall kitchen, and someone needs to go out before the roads close to warn the outlying homesteads." Cole was quiet for a second. He was looking at her with the expression that had become familiar to her over the past weeks, the one she still hadn't entirely named, the one that had something different in it from anything else she recognized in him. "All right," he said. Then, to the room. "Hatch." Hatch appeared out of the crowd as though he'd been waiting. He probably had been. "Get Red and Eric and anyone else who can ride," Cole said. "We've got weather coming hard from the northwest. We need riders on the north road before it closes." He looked at Eleanor. "Who else is out that way?" "The Pierce homestead," she said. "The Calloway family, the Henriksen boys." She'd learned the geography of the valley the same way she'd learned everything else, quietly, systematically, because knowing the landscape of a place you're trying to make your home is basic common sense. Hatch was already moving. Cole looked back at Eleanor and she could see him make a decision. Not a hesitant one, but the kind that's already been half made before the moment of making it. "I'm riding with them," he said. "Can you manage here?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I need you to mean that." "I mean it," she said. "Go." He held her gaze for one more second, then he went. Eleanor turned to the room where people had begun to sense that the evening had changed, conversations faltering and heads turning toward the windows, children picking up on the adults' shift in energy and going quiet. She looked at the faces, families, strangers, people who had come for a pleasant supper and were now facing a night they hadn't prepared for. And she thought, briefly and practically, about what needed to happen in the next 30 minutes. Then she walked to the center of the room and spoke. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She had the kind of voice that carried when it had something to say, not because it was loud, but because it was certain. "Attention, please," Eleanor said. The room quieted. "There's a storm coming in hard from the northwest, Anyone traveling more than 2 miles tonight is not going to make it safely. We're going to shelter here tonight. Those who need to, those who want to. This is not an emergency if we handle it right. Here's what we're going to do." The room watched her. May Darrow, standing near the back wall with her husband, had her eyes fixed on Eleanor with an expression that had moved a long way from what it had been that morning. Eleanor started talking. The food rationing, the sleeping arrangements, the wood supply, the warming of the church building, the accounting for who was where so that nobody was missing when the storm arrived in full force. She gave people tasks because people with tasks don't panic. And she matched the tasks to the people with the quick instinct of someone who had been reading rooms and understanding people's capacities her whole life. Beatrice Hollowell, organized and capable, took charge of settling the children. Carol Jessup, who knew the hall kitchen better than anyone else, managed the food. Ida Pierce, who had the particular competence of a woman who had been running a homestead alone for 4 years, organized the bedding situation. The storm hit just before 9. It came with a force that shook the hall walls and drove snow horizontal across the windows, the kind of blizzard that doesn't sneak up on you. It arrives like an argument, loud and committed. The temperature outside dropped to something that stopped being a number and started being a fact about survival. Inside, the fires were high and the lamps burned, and children slept under every available coat and blanket on the church pew cushions and the hall floor. Eleanor moved through it all with the concentration of someone running a complicated problem in real time. Not panicked, not performing calm, simply working with the focused attention of a person who has decided that panic is not useful and who means it. Outside, somewhere in the dark and the driving snow, Cole and the others were riding. She didn't let herself think about that. She went back to work. It was past midnight when the hall door crashed open on a gust of wind and Cole came through it, ice on his coat and his face raw from the cold, and behind him Red and Eric and 2 of the Calloway family's grown sons, who had been caught partway to town when the weather hit and had been brought in by the riders. Eleanor was standing near the kitchen doorway with account of the food situation in her head when Cole came through the door, and she looked at him from across the hall, and he looked back at her, and she could see that he was all right, cold and exhausted, but all right. And something that had been very tightly coiled inside her chest since he left let go. She went to the kitchen and came back with 2 mugs of coffee and crossed the hall and held one out to him. He took it with both hands, too cold to have any manners about it, and drank half of it standing up. "The Pierce homestead?" Eleanor said. "Secured," he said. "Ida's foreman had the sense to get everyone into the main barn before we arrived. Calloway family's here. You can see that. Henriksen boys were already on their way in when we reached them." He looked around the hall. The sleeping children, the quiet adults, the fires, the organized, improvised order of a community sheltering together. Then he looked at her. "You did this." "Everybody did this," Eleanor said. He looked at her the way Hatch had told her not to deflect, and she met it. "All right," she said. "Yes, I did." Something in his face relaxed into something she hadn't seen there before. Not the complicated expression she'd been cataloging for weeks. Something simpler and more direct. Something that didn't seem to require effort to maintain. "Thank you," Cole said. Eleanor drank her coffee. "You should dry off before you freeze in here," she said. "There's dry clothes from the contribution pile near the east wall." Beatrice organized it. He looked at her for a second longer. One of those looks that had started happening more often lately, the ones that lingered past the practical content of whatever they were supposedly about. And then he went. Eleanor turned to find Hatch standing directly behind her. "You could give a man a warning," she said. "You did a hell of a thing," Hatch said, for the second time that night. "Go drink your coffee," Eleanor said, and went back to work. The storm blew itself out by 3 in the morning, leaving the valley buried under 2 feet of snow and the road through the pass sealed until the light. In the hall and the church, Black Hollow slept in improvised arrangements, strangers sharing floor space, children piled together in the corner that had been designated the children's corner. Old men who had known each other for 20 years sleeping back to back against the wall for warmth and warmth alone, because survival had a way of making other considerations small. Eleanor did not sleep. She kept the fires fed and the lamp oil managed and the accounting of who was where current in her head, because that was what needed doing, and she was the one to do it. Near 4 in the morning, the hall was as quiet as it was going to get, and she sat in the chair nearest the kitchen door with a cup of tea that had gone cold and looked at the sleeping room full of people who had come for a supper and gotten something they hadn't expected. She thought about Cole riding into the dark with the storm coming. She thought about Hatch, unprompted, saying her name in the church. She thought about Red eating 2 bowls of stew and saying, "Don't make it weird." She thought about Ada Pullman and the good lard and a smile that was small and not given carelessly. She thought about this valley, this difficult, cold, beautiful valley, and the ranch at the end of the road where the sourdough starter was alive in its jar by the range, and the ledger was organized and the garden had garlic in the ground that would come up in spring. She was still a stranger here, but she was a stranger who had kept 24 families warm through the worst night of the early winter. That was not the same as belonging, but it was, she thought, the beginning of a path toward it. She drank the cold tea and let the fires burn and watched the dark outside the windows slowly, barely perceptibly, begin to change. Dawn came slowly to Black Hollow after the storm, the way it always does when the sky is still loaded with cloud and the world has been rearranged overnight. The light didn't arrive so much as seep in, a pale, reluctant gray that came through the church hall windows and touched the faces of the sleeping families before anyone was ready to wake up. Eleanor had watched it happen from her chair by the kitchen door. She had not slept. She'd been aware, through the long hours, of the particular quality of not sleeping that isn't restlessness, but something more like watchfulness. The same state she'd been in during the worst winters at the mining boarding house, when the furnace had a habit of going out at 3 in the morning and someone needed to be listening for it. Her body had learned over years to be useful during the hours when other people slept. The fires had not gone out. She'd made sure of that. By the time the first of the children stirred, a small girl of about 4, who had been sleeping in a nest of coats near the south wall and who woke with the immediate, unembarrassed hunger of the very young, Eleanor was already in the kitchen getting the range running for breakfast. The hall's kitchen was not her kitchen, but she'd spent the previous day learning its particular temperament, and she knew where everything lived now, knew which drawer stuck and which pot had a handle you needed to hold at an angle. She was cracking eggs into a bowl when Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had slept a few hours. She could tell by the slight softening around his eyes, but he'd been awake long enough to have put his coat back on, and his hair was doing the thing it did when he'd been out in the cold, standing up slightly at the sides where his hat brim didn't cover. "How many eggs do we have?" he asked, because Cole Mercer's version of good morning had always been practical. 43, Eleanor said, plus whatever the Jessup family has in their wagon, assuming the cold kept them. "I'll check." He turned to go and then stopped. "You didn't sleep." "I slept some." He looked at her with the expression that meant he knew this was not precisely true and had decided to let it go. "I'll get the eggs." He came back 8 minutes later with Carol Jessup's full egg crate and a report on the road conditions outside. 2 feet of snow at least, drifting to 4 in the gaps between buildings. The pass road solid until the afternoon thaw if there was one, which was not guaranteed this late in the season. "We're feeding everyone this morning," Eleanor said, not as a question. "Yes," Cole said. She handed him the bowl. "Start beating these." He looked at the bowl. He was not a man who had spent time in kitchens doing kitchen work, and there was a brief moment where this was visible on his face. Not resistance exactly, just the slight disorientation of a person handed a task outside their practiced territory. Then he found a fork and started beating eggs, and Eleanor moved past him to check the bread situation. And that was how they worked for the next hour, side by side in a kitchen that was not theirs, producing breakfast for 60-something people with the focused cooperation of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms in a different kitchen weeks ago. Red appeared at the kitchen door at some point, looked at Cole beating eggs, and opened his mouth. "Don't," Eleanor said, without turning around. Red closed his mouth. He picked up the coffee pot and went. Cole, still beating eggs, made a sound that was approximately a laugh. Brief and quiet. But there. The kind that comes out before a person decides whether to let it. Eleanor heard it and kept her eyes on the bread. The morning unfolded in layers, the way mornings after difficult nights tend to. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in the accumulating pieces of people waking and remembering where they were and what had happened and beginning to take stock. Families gathered their children and their borrowed blankets and found each other in the hall and at the church. Men went outside to assess the damage and came back with reports. Two supply sheds on the east side of town had lost portions of their roofs to the weight of the snow. A section of the church's fence line had collapsed. The road east was passable on horseback, but not by wagon, at least not yet. The road north, over the pass, was not passable at all. A rancher named Thaddeus Weller, whose property was 7 miles north and who had been one of the families sheltered overnight, stood in the middle of the hall with his hat in his hands and his face doing the work of a man performing calm over something that was genuinely frightening. "My wife's up there," he said to Cole, to the room, to anyone. "She didn't come with me last night. She wasn't feeling well. If the stock shed lost its roof—" "How many head do you have in the shed?" Cole asked. 22, plus the horses." Cole looked at Eleanor across the room. She had been listening from the kitchen doorway with a plate of food in each hand and a list already building in her head. "Eric," Cole said, without raising his voice. Eric materialized. He'd been at the far wall, eating with the economical focus of a man who treats food as fuel and nothing else. "Can you get north?" Cole asked. Eric looked at the ceiling briefly, running some internal calculation involving snow depth and the particular personality of the mountain roads he'd been traveling for 8 years. "On Hector, yes." Hector was the big gray horse that was, in Eric's undemonstrative opinion, the finest animal in Black Hollow, and this was not merely sentiment. Hector was 17 hands of mountain-bred Norwegian stock who moved through bad terrain with the deliberate intelligence of an animal that understood self-preservation. "Take Hatch," Cole said. "Check the Weller property. If there's structural damage, we figure out what we can do from here." "My wife," Thaddeus Weller started. "We'll get word to her," Cole said. "And if she needs moving, we'll move her." He said it with the flat certainty that was not a performance, but simply the register of a man who had decided something and was not interested in debating it. Weller sat down heavily in the nearest chair, the kind of sit that happens when the legs decide on their own that they've held enough weight. Eleanor crossed the hall and set one of the plates in front of him. "Eat something," she said. "You're not helping her by standing." He looked at the plate, then at Eleanor. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was a different texture than the one he'd been using for the past 5 minutes. She went back to the kitchen. Breakfast was not a graceful operation. It was a crowd of tired, cold, hungry people in a space not quite big enough for all of them, and the food was simple and not nearly as plentiful as Eleanor would have liked, and there were children who were difficult after a night of disrupted sleep, and one man, a miner who had been at the saloon when the storm hit and had ended up sheltering in the church, who was still somewhat drunk and mildly hostile about the egg situation. But it was breakfast, it was hot, and it was enough. And by the time the room had eaten, the quality of the noise inside it had shifted from anxious to functional. This was the thing Eleanor understood about food that went beyond the cooking of it. It was not just fuel, it was signal. A warm meal produced with evident care told people something about their situation, that someone was thinking ahead, that things were organized, that the chaos around them had a center that was holding. It didn't fix anything, but it changed what people thought was possible, and that changed what they did next. She had learned this at 14 in the first house she'd worked, in Pittsburgh, when a cook named Ruth Brennan had taken her aside after Eleanor had served a badly timed, half-cold supper to a family already stretched by bad news and said, "The food is never just the food. Remember that." She had never forgotten it. The morning worked itself out the way complicated mornings do. Not toward resolution exactly, but toward a kind of temporary order in which the next manageable hour becomes possible. Eric and Hatch rode north and returned 3 hours later with the news that the Weller property had lost a section of the feed barn roof, but that Mrs. Weller herself was unharmed and the livestock were sheltered in the main barn, which had held. There were repairs needed, but nothing catastrophic. Thaddeus Weller closed his eyes for a full 10 seconds when he heard this and then stood and shook Cole's hand with both of his for an uncomfortably long time. By noon, the road east had thawed enough for the first wagons to leave. Families gathered their things and their children and came to find Eleanor, which was something she hadn't expected. Not Cole, not Beatrice Hollowell, not the town's official structures, but Eleanor specifically, to say something before they left. Not all of them, and not all of what they said was easy or effusive. Ida Pierce, who was not a woman given to sentiment, pressed Eleanor's hand firmly and said, "Good work," in the tone of one professional to another, which was worth more to Eleanor than any number of warmer gestures. Carol Jessup hugged her, briefly and without warning. The young Calloway sons, who were in their early 20s and had been among the families brought in from the road during the storm, stopped on their way out, and one of them said, with the slightly awkward sincerity of young men, not entirely sure how to express things, "You kept everybody right last night, ma'am. Our mother wanted you to know that." Eleanor thanked them and meant it. May Darrow left in the middle of the afternoon, after helping to fold and sort the borrowed bedding with a systematic thoroughness that indicated she'd been channeling something into the task. She stopped near the hall door where Eleanor was doing a final inventory of what needed returning to what owner. "I owe you an apology," May Darrow said. Eleanor looked up. May's face was doing the complicated work of a person who has built a position over time and has realized the position was wrong and is not comfortable with either the realization or the admission. Her voice was not entirely steady. I said things, made assumptions." "Yes," Eleanor said. Not harshly, just accurately. May pressed her lips together. "Eliza Mercer was my friend. She stopped. "I think I took it out on you, and that wasn't right. You're not responsible for who came before you." Eleanor thought about this for a moment. She thought about what it cost this particular woman to be standing in a doorway saying this. "I know you were her friend," she said. "I'm sorry you lost her." May blinked. She'd been prepared for something else, and the directness of this landed differently than she'd expected. "She'd have liked you," she said, and there was something raw at the edges of it. She had no patience for nonsense either. It was not entirely a compliment, but it wasn't not one either. "Thank you," Eleanor said. May nodded briskly and went, tying her bonnet strings with the focused attention of a woman redirecting herself from something that had gotten closer to feeling than she intended. Eleanor watched her go. She had not expected that. She was not sure what to do with it, fully, but she filed it away in the same careful place where she kept the other things that had happened in this town that she hadn't anticipated. By late afternoon, the hall was emptied and cleaned, Eleanor's doing primarily, though Beatrice Hollowell had stayed to help and had turned out to be both useful and surprisingly unsentimental about hard work, moving chairs and sweeping floors without the fuss Eleanor might have expected from a minister's wife. "You should rest," Beatrice said, as they put the last of the chairs back. "I'll rest when I'm back at the ranch." "That's what people say when they're not going to rest." Eleanor looked at her. Beatrice Hollowell had a direct gaze that she generally kept somewhat softened by social manner, and in this moment the social manner had thinned out to reveal the actual woman behind it, who was sharper and funnier and more observant than the minister's wife version of herself usually showed. "You did something important last night," Beatrice said. "Not just the food. The way you handled the room when people started to panic. Some of these families—" She paused. "Some of them have been here long enough that they've seen bad winters go very wrong. Having someone stand up in the middle of that room and speak with that kind of certainty, it mattered." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I was just doing what needed doing." "I know," Beatrice said. "That's my point." Cole came to collect Eleanor and the remaining ranch supplies at 5, and the drive home was quiet in the way of people who have been through something together and don't need to fill the space between them with words. The snow was deep in the fields on either side of the road, blue-shadowed in the late afternoon light, and the mountains above were white to their bases, the high ridges lost in cloud. Everything was very still in the aftermath of the storm, that particular post-blizzard silence that comes when the wind has said everything it had to say and moved on. Eleanor looked at the road ahead and felt the tiredness she'd been holding off all day settle into her properly, into her shoulders and her feet and the back of her eyes. She was thoroughly, genuinely tired. Not the edge of despair tired she'd felt in her worst years, but the honest worn-out tired of too much work and too little sleep, and there was a difference between those two things that she had learned to be grateful for. "How's the road through the pass?" she asked after a while. "Still closed. Should open by tomorrow afternoon if the temperature holds." Cole looked at the sky. "It'll hold." She nodded. They drove on. The horses knew the road and moved with quiet confidence through the snow. "Weller wanted to know who to thank," Cole said. "He should thank you. You sent the riders." "He said the riders were your idea." "Hatch would have thought of it." "Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her given name. Not Miss Vane, not the formal version, but her name, spoken without announcement, without self-consciousness, as though it had simply arrived in its natural form without him deciding to deploy it. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the road, but there was a slight tension along his jaw. The signs she'd learned meant he was working up to saying something that required more from him than practical conversation. "You can take credit for a thing without it costing you," he said. "I don't know where you learned that it does, but—" He stopped. "You don't have to hand it off every time." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. The horse's breath made clouds in the cold air. "I'm not used to it mattering whose idea it was," she said finally. "In most of the places I've worked, taking credit for something meant somebody else was looking for a reason to resent you." He thought about this. "That's a hard way to learn things." "Yes. This isn't those places." She looked at him. He was still watching the road, but the line of his jaw had eased slightly. "No," she said. "I'm starting to understand that." The ranch came into view around the bend in the road, and the kitchen window had a light in it from the lamp Eleanor had left burning low, and the smoke from the chimney went straight up in the still air. Red had come back ahead of them and was bringing the horses in from the east field, his red hair vivid against the white snow, moving with his usual angular energy. It looked, Eleanor thought, like a place that had someone in it. It had not always looked that way. She climbed down from the wagon before Cole could come around to help, because the habit of managing for herself was older than any of this and carried the kitchen supplies inside. The sourdough starter was alive and active in its jar by the range. She'd asked Red, specifically and with clear instructions, to keep the range warm while they were in town. He had. She hadn't been certain he would, and the fact that he had settled something small and practical in her that she hadn't known was unsettled. She put supper together while Cole tended the horses, and by the time he and Red and the hands who had stayed at the ranch came in from the cold, the kitchen smelled the way it had smelled every evening for the past 6 weeks, like a room in use, like a house with a pulse. Supper that night was quieter than usual, the particular quiet of tired people who are not uncomfortable with each other. Red ate without comment, which from Red meant contentment. Eric, who had ridden to the Weller property and back in the worst of the morning snow, consumed more food than anyone and went to bed directly after with the single-minded efficiency of a man who had burned through every reserve he had. Hatch sat at the table longer than usual, nursing his coffee, and when Eleanor cleared the plates, he said, without looking up, "The Weller boy, the youngest one, Thomas, about 10 years old, he came and found me before they left this morning." Eleanor waited, said to tell the lady who kept the fires going thank you. Hatch turned his cup in his hands. "Didn't know your name, just said the lady who kept the fires going." Eleanor stacked the plates at the sink. "That's a fine thing to be called," she said. Hatch nodded. He finished his coffee and went. The house settled into its evening. Eleanor washed the supper dishes alone, the way she often did, which was a time she had come to think of as her own. The quiet end of the workday, the house breathing around her, the sounds of men winding down in the common room. She was on the last pot when she heard boots on the floorboards and knew, by the particular sound of them, who it was. Cole poured himself coffee and then didn't leave. This had become a thing that happened, him staying in the kitchen after supper on some evenings, the ostensible purpose shifting over time from checking on the pantry to discussing the accounts to nothing in particular. Eleanor had stopped pretending there was always a practical reason for it. She suspected he had too. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired." She didn't dress it up. "It was a long night." "Sit down then, the pot can wait." She turned around and looked at the half-washed pot, and then at him. "The pot will be worse in the morning," she said. "I know," he said. "Sit down anyway." She sat down at the kitchen table. He sat across from her, the same configuration as the night they'd gone over the ledger together, and it struck her that the kitchen table had become the place where most of the real conversations in this house happened. Not the parlor, not the study, but here, the functional heart of the house, the room that had been broken when she arrived, and that was, now, more itself than any other room in the building. "I've been thinking," Cole said, and then he paused in the way he did when the thought was not entirely ready. Eleanor waited. She had learned that he worked better when not pushed. "When I put that advertisement in the paper," he said, "I had a very limited picture of what I was looking for, someone to manage the house. Keep the men fed. make the domestic side of the ranch function. He turned his coffee mug. That was the whole of it. I know, Eleanor said. You were clear about that. I was clear about what I thought I needed. I wasn't clear about what I actually... He stopped. I wasn't clear about a lot of things. She looked at him. The lamp between them threw shadows, and his face had the quality it sometimes had in the evenings. Less guarded than during the working day, the careful management he maintained during daylight hours having loosened with the late hour into something closer to actual expression. The ranch is different, he said, since you came. And I don't just mean the kitchen, though the whole house is different. The men are different. He stopped again. I'm different. And I didn't expect that. I didn't build it into my picture of what this arrangement was going to be. Eleanor was very still. I don't know what to do with that, Cole said, with the flat, slightly frustrated honesty of a man who is accustomed to knowing what to do with things. I want to be straight with you, the way you asked me to be that first night. You have been, Eleanor said. I want to be straight about this. He looked at her, really looked, the kind that doesn't have anywhere else to be. I don't want this to be an arrangement. The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, the snow was deep, and the night was still, and the mountains were invisible behind their cloud cover, and somewhere in the barn the horses were settled and breathing. Eleanor looked at Cole Mercer across the kitchen table that had become the most important piece of furniture in her life, and she thought about what she had arrived with: a carpet bag and capable hands and the careful expectation of nothing beyond survival. I don't know how to do this, she said. Not an apology, just a fact. Neither do I, Cole said. I've been making a hash of it for 3 years. That's not... She stopped. You haven't been making a hash of it. You've been grieving. Those aren't the same thing. Something crossed his face quickly. You never mention Eliza. It's not my place to mention her. It could be, he said. I mean, she was here. She built the garden you're growing things in. The kitchen you're working in was hers. I don't want you to feel... He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of genuine frustration that she found more reassuring than anything polished would have been. I don't want it to be a weight you're carrying. Eleanor thought about Ada Pullman and the flower, about May Darrow in the doorway that afternoon, about the kitchen garden in the spring. She sounds like she was someone worth knowing, Eleanor said carefully. Cole's face did something complicated and honest. She was, he said. She was completely herself, always. That was the thing about her. She never seemed to wonder if she was doing it right. He was quiet. I think that's part of why when you arrived and you were so... He shook his head slightly. You're nothing like her. No, Eleanor said. I know. I don't mean it as a... I know you don't. She looked at her hands on the table, the rough, capable hands that were the most honest thing about her. I'm exactly what I look like, Mr. Mercer. I always have been. I never had the luxury of being anything else. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Cole. She looked up. You called me Mr. Mercer, he said. In the wagon. Today, I used your name. I think we've... A breath. I think we've been past Mr. Mercer for a while. The beginning of something, not quite a smile, but the physical precursor to one, moved across Eleanor's face before she had time to decide about it. Cole, she said. He looked at her with the expression that she had spent 6 weeks cataloging and had finally, quietly understood. It was not complicated. It was simply a man looking at a woman he had not expected and finding that the unexpectedness had become, somehow, the whole point. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, he said. I want to be clear about that. You're being clear, she said. I needed you to know where I was. She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had sent a businesslike letter and met her with disappointment on a platform, and sat across from her at this table enough times that the sitting had built into something neither of them had planned. I know where you are, she said. It was not, she would have been the first to admit, a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was two careful people in a kitchen after a difficult night telling each other something true. And it was enough for now. Perhaps more than enough, more than Eleanor had let herself expect of anything in a very long time. Cole finished his coffee. She finished hers. The lamp burned between them, and neither of them was in a hurry to move. Outside, the snow was new and deep, and the pass was still closed, and the valley was sealed in its winter silence, and the Mercer Ranch sat in the dark with its windows lit, a small warm fact in a very cold world. Eventually, Cole said, quietly, without making it into more than it was, "You should sleep. You haven't slept properly in 2 days." "I know," Eleanor said. "I'll see the lamp out." She stood, and he stood. And they were very close for a moment, in the way people are when they've been sitting across a small table and the standing up hasn't yet produced the normal distance. Neither of them moved for a second that stretched just slightly past the practical. Then Eleanor said goodnight and went upstairs, and Cole turned out the lamp, and the kitchen went dark. But it was not empty the way it had been empty before. That was the difference. That was the thing that neither of them had a clean word for yet. The house was not empty anymore, and not just because Eleanor Vane was in it, but because something that had been absent from it for 3 years had come back in without announcement or fanfare, the way most real things arrive, quietly and without ceremony, until you look up one day and understand it has been there for longer than you knew. In the barn, Eric's horse shifted its weight and blew through its nose and settled again. In the kitchen, the sourdough starter worked steadily in its jar, alive and patient and reliable, turning simple things into something worth having. The snow outside caught the starlight where the clouds had broken, and the valley gleamed. The next morning, Eleanor was in the kitchen before light, and when Cole came down the stairs, she had coffee waiting without being asked, and he took the mug and stood beside the range for a moment in the gray early dark. And neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. But the morning felt different from the ones before it. Not resolved, not simple, not without the complications that two cautious and damaged people bring to anything they try to build together, but different in the particular way of things that have shifted on their foundations. Not broken, not remade, but moved, turned slightly toward the light. Eleanor cracked the first eggs into the bowl. Cole drank his coffee. Outside, the snow was beginning to catch the first suggestion of dawn, turning from blue to silver along the high ridges, and the Mercer Ranch began its day the way it had begun every day for the past 6 weeks, with work and warmth and the particular ordinary rhythm of people learning, slowly and imperfectly, to inhabit the same life. The pass opened on the second day after the storm, and Black Hollow spent the following week digging itself out with the collective efficiency of a community that had done this before. Supply sheds were repaired, fences were checked and restrung where snow weight had brought them down. The road north cleared enough for wagons by Wednesday, and Thaddeus Weller got his feed barn roof patched with lumber donated by 3 neighboring ranches. People showing up with what was needed because the alternative was watching a neighbor go under, and nobody wanted to look at that. Eleanor watched this from the edges, the way she watched most things in Black Hollow, and revised certain of her early assessments. The town was not as cruel as it had initially appeared. It was guarded, the guardedness of people who lived with difficulty and had learned to conserve emotional resources. But underneath that guardedness was a functional generosity that showed itself in practical ways rather than warm ones, lumber and labor rather than sentiment. It was not a demonstrative community, but it was not an uncaring one. She was thinking about this when Cole found her in the kitchen on the Thursday after the storm, going over the household accounts, with a precision born from years of managing other people's money carefully. He set a cup of coffee beside her without being asked. He had started doing this, small domestic attentions that arrived without announcement, and pulled out the chair across the table. "The December numbers," he said, looking at the ledger she'd turned toward him. "First time in 4 years they're not showing a deficit," Eleanor said. Cole was quiet for a moment, running his finger down the column. The household expenditure was down significantly from the previous year. The waste reduction alone had saved enough to cover a full month of winter feed. "You see where it comes from," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. "The small numbers," he said always the small numbers. He closed the ledger and looked at her with the expression she had spent weeks cataloging and had finally, quietly, understood. It was not complicated anymore. It was simply a man looking at a woman he had underestimated, and finding that the underestimation had become, at some point he couldn't pinpoint, entirely untenable. "I went to the East Ridge today," he said. Eleanor waited. "I used to go up there when things were bad, after Eliza died. I'd go because it was the only place on the ranch where I couldn't see anything that needed doing, nothing to fix, nothing I was failing at." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "I hadn't been up there in about 4 months. And today? Today I went up and looked at the ranch, and for the first time in 3 years, what I saw didn't make me tired. He set the mug down. I know why it's different. And I think you know too. Eleanor looked at her hands on the table, the rough, work-honest hands that were the most accurate thing about her. I'm not pressing you, Cole said. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I told you that and I meant it. He stopped. Honesty was the agreement we had from the beginning. This is me being honest. She looked at him. When I answered that advertisement, she said, I told myself I was being practical, that I was making a sensible decision about what my life could realistically be. She paused. I told myself not to expect anything beyond the arrangement, that expecting more was how a person in my position ended up worse off than when she started. A person in your position, Cole repeated, not as a challenge. As something else. Someone who'd been too many places and left all of them. Someone who had learned not to... She stopped. I was careful. I am careful. I've been careful about this since the first week. I know, he said. I could see it. And it didn't change anything? No. Simple and direct. I watched you be careful and I thought, this is a woman who built a wall out of practicality, and I understood it completely because I'd been doing the same thing for 3 years. Except you're better at it than I am. Something shifted in her chest. Something that had been braced against exactly this moment. I'm not going to pretend the past 2 months have been only practical, she said finally. Cole was very still. What are you afraid of? He asked. Specifically. She appreciated the specifically. It was the word of a man who didn't want a general answer. That I'll allow it, she said, and then something will pull the ground out and I'll be further from anything solid than I was when I came. That's a fair fear, he said. I know. I can't promise you certainty. I don't have it to give. He held her gaze. I can tell you I'm not going anywhere. I can tell you I've only done this once before and I did it for the rest of her life. That's the only way I know how to do it. Eleanor thought about Eliza Mercer's kitchen garden, the garlic she'd planted in it, the kitchen that had been rebuilt from ruin. I'm not afraid of Eliza, she said, because she needed him to know that. I want to be clear. I know. She mattered. She mattered enormously, he said, without hesitation. And you matter differently, not less. 2 different true things can both be true. The fire in the range ticked and settled. Outside, the wind that had destroyed the storm had moved on, and the valley was in the particular stillness of aftermath. Cole, she said, and watched the slight change in his face at hearing his name from her in that specific register. I've been carrying this wrong, the practicality. I've been using it as a reason not to let anything in, rather than as a way to manage what's already there. He was listening with the complete, unhurried attention that was one of his particular qualities. I don't know how to do this gracefully, she said. I've never done it. I came here knowing how to work and how to manage and how to make something functional out of broken pieces, and I don't know that those are the right skills for this particular... Eleanor. His voice was quiet. They're exactly the right skills. That's what this is. 2 people making something functional out of broken pieces. She looked at him across the kitchen table, at this man who had met her with disappointment on a platform and sat across from her enough times since then that the sitting had built into something neither of them had planned and neither of them now wanted to dismantle. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right? I'm done being careful in the wrong direction, she said. That's what I mean. Something in Cole's face relaxed into something she had not seen there before. Not the complicated expression she'd been cataloging for weeks. Not the managed neutrality of the early days. Something that didn't require effort to maintain. Something that was simply him, without the distance he'd learned to keep between himself and anything that mattered. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, just his hand, warm and work-worn, over her work-worn hands. She turned her palm up under his. That was all. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. They sat there for a while, and the conversation that followed was easy in the way conversations become when whatever made them effortful has been resolved. Talking about small things, the South herd, the December accounts, the supper at the Darrows that May had proposed, the question of the sourdough and whether it was ready for a proper loaf. Ordinary things made different by the shift in the atmosphere between them. When Cole said goodnight that night, He said it the way you say goodnight to someone whose absence from the room you will actually feel. Eleanor said it back the same way. She heard him on the stairs and sat alone in the kitchen for a few minutes, not avoiding sleep but inhabiting the quiet on purpose, because it was a quality of quiet she hadn't had before tonight. She went upstairs and slept well, which she hadn't done in longer than she could reliably remember. The call on Mabel Croft happened the following Tuesday. Eleanor drove herself, bringing sourdough bread because arriving empty-handed was not in her nature. The Croft house was the most organized domestic space Eleanor had entered since arriving. Every object placed with purpose, comfort achieved through system. Mabel herself was a compact, iron-spined woman whose broken bones had done nothing to diminish the precision of her gaze. "Sit down," Mabel said, without preamble. Eleanor sat. Silas Croft appeared, was dispatched for tea, and disappeared again with the efficiency of a man who had made peace with being managed. "I heard your menu for the harvest supper," Mabel said. "In detail. Carol Jessup talks. I know. You got 4 contributors to deliver exactly what they promised in exactly the right quantities. How?" "I managed their anxiety rather than their commitments," Eleanor said. "A confident person delivers. A worried person either over-prepares or fails." Mabel regarded her with the specific expression of one organizational mind recognizing another. 9 years of this, and nobody's said that to me in those words. "You probably didn't need to say it. You just did it." The tea arrived. Mabel poured without asking Eleanor's preference, having already decided, which Eleanor found not presumptuous, but quietly accurate. "I want to propose something," Mabel said. "Next year, after the thaw, the valley has a problem with spring provisioning. 6 to 8 families run short before the first supply wagons get through the pass every year. Predictable. Preventable. Nobody has built a system for it because nobody has had the organizational capacity and the motivation simultaneously." A pause. "I've had the motivation for years and I apparently break bones." "What are you proposing?" "A community stores program. Administered cooperatively, supplied before winter closes the pass, distributed in spring as needed. Someone needs to run the accounting and logistics." She looked at Eleanor directly. "I'm proposing you." Eleanor set her cup down. She had come to be evaluated. She had not expected to be recruited. "I'd need to understand the full scope," she said. "Participating families, capital, storage arrangements." "Obviously," Mabel said, "I didn't think you'd agree without knowing what you were agreeing to." "And Cole would need to, but Cole Mercer will say yes to anything you ask him," Mabel said, with the flat certainty of someone stating a meteorological fact. "That's not manipulation, it's observation. You've earned his trust and his—" She paused. "His other feelings are visible to anyone paying attention." Eleanor did not pursue this. "I'll consider it. That's all I'm asking." They talked for another hour. About the valley's supply routes, about the political geography of Black Hollow's family allegiances, about what cooperative efforts required and where they failed. Mabel talked with the authority of someone who had been observing this community with precision for 2 decades, and Eleanor listened with the comprehensive attention that had always been one of her most useful qualities. When she stood to leave, Mabel's expression had settled into something that was not warmth in the conventional sense, but was its functional equivalent, the respect between 2 people who have accurately assessed each other. "Come back Thursday," Mabel said. "I'll have preliminary figures ready." "Thursday," Eleanor agreed, "and the bread is excellent." She drove home through the cold, clear afternoon with Mabel's proposal sitting in her mind alongside everything else that had accumulated, and she thought about accumulation, about how a life gets built not from one large decision, but from the layering of small ones, each narrowing or opening the possibilities of the next, until the accumulation becomes a shape, becomes something with weight and presence. Cole was at the porch when she pulled in, replacing the railing section that had been deteriorating since October. He turned when he heard the wagon and watched her drive in and climb down, and his face did the thing she had stopped cataloging and started simply recognizing. "How is Mabel?" he called. "Formidable," Eleanor said. "She wants me to run a community stores program in the spring." Cole set down his hammer. "Of course she does. Is that all you're going to say? You'd be good at it." He picked the hammer back up. "We'll figure out the time." She went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the room that was hers now in every practical sense. The organized shelves, the working range, the sourdough in its jar, the ledger on the side table, the hooks where her apron hung beside Cole's good coat. The proximity of their things a quiet fact about the proximity of their lives. She had not unpacked the carpet bag. She went upstairs, opened the bag, and began taking things out. The dresses, the wool shawl, the small mirror, the comb. She put them where they belonged, in the wardrobe on the dresser, not with ceremony but with the simple decisiveness of a woman finishing something that should have been done weeks ago. The leather notebook she set on the bedside table. She looked at it for a moment, then went back downstairs and started supper. Through the kitchen window she could see Cole at the porch railing, working steadily in the late afternoon cold, the hammer ringing out across the quiet yard. The sound was ordinary and specific and exactly right. Red appeared in the kitchen doorway and sniffed the air with the unselfconscious appreciation he had stopped pretending he didn't have. That sourdough bread again? Yes. Good. He leaned against the door frame. Hatch wants to know if you're making that bean thing, from the first night. Eleanor looked at him. Red met her eyes with the expression of a man who has traveled a long distance from his opening position and is not going to discuss the journey. Tell Hatch yes, she said. Red pushed off the doorframe and went. Eleanor turned back to the range. She had arrived with nothing, and she stood here now with something she was only beginning to understand the full dimensions of. Not wealth, not security in any conventional sense, not a smoothed-out version of a life. Something rougher and more real. Something built from actual materials, work, honesty, the willingness to stay somewhere long enough to belong to it. The range was hot. The bread was rising. Outside, the hammer was steady and sure. The sound of a man repairing what had been broken, making it solid again. She had done that too, in her own way, in the only way she knew. The leather notebook sat on the bedside table for 11 days before Eleanor opened it. Not because she was avoiding it. She simply hadn't made the moment, which amounted to the same thing. It was a small book with a dark cover, corners worn soft from 8 years of being carried without being used, and taking it out of the carpet bag had felt like an act with implications she wasn't ready to examine. On the 11th day, a Sunday, with the ranch quiet around her and snow sitting still and dry outside the window, she opened it. Her own handwriting from 8 years ago looked back at her, younger in its formation, the pen pressure uneven, the writing of someone working under bad light or in a hurry. A date, October 1871. Underneath, things I will not forget. Then nothing for 6 pages. Then a list, the name of a cook in Pittsburgh who had been decent to her without making a performance of it. The price difference between good work boots and cheap ones, and how many weeks of service the Gap bought you. The best way to revive a neglected sourdough starter. A bread recipe reconstructed from memory because her mother had never formally taught it, and Eleanor had pieced it back together from what her hands remembered, 40 pages. The careful archive of a woman who had been losing things her whole life and had decided to keep what she could in the only place nobody could take from her. She turned to the first blank page. She uncapped her pen and wrote the date, December 1879, and then she sat for a moment and wrote, I unpacked the bag. That was enough. She closed the notebook and went downstairs to start supper. The January ceremony was small, which was Eleanor's preference, and which Cole accepted without discussion. Hatch and Beatrice Hollowell as witnesses. Ada Pullman, because it was Ada, and some things were simply inevitable. The ranch hands who were on the property. Red and Eric and a newer hand named Pete, who was still figuring out what kind of place he'd come to work. The justice of the peace drove out from town on a Wednesday morning, a man named Aldridge who had performed this function enough times that he delivered the ceremony without unnecessary decoration, which suited both of them equally. Eleanor wore her better dress. She had done her hair with slightly more attention than usual. She looked exactly like herself, which was the only version of herself she had, and which had proved, against every prior expectation, to be sufficient. Cole wore his good coat and had shaved properly and stood beside her with the settled quality of a man who has made a decision he is entirely certain about. When Aldridge reached the part that required her answer, Eleanor said, I am, in a voice that was steady and meant exactly what it said. Cole said, I do, the same way. Aldridge pronounced them married, shook Cole's hand, and accepted Hatch's coffee because it was 15 degrees outside and he had driven 8 miles. Red stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed and his hat in his hands, and his face had the expression of a man at a ceremony who has decided not to let the occasion affect him and is losing that battle in small, incremental ways he was fairly certain no one was watching. He was wrong about that. Eleanor noticed. She said nothing. After Aldridge left, the ranch ate together at the long dining table. The sourdough bread, the smoked pork from the root cellar, the preserved summer tomatoes, the dried apple cake that had become a winter staple. Hatch raised his coffee mug at some point and said, without preamble, "To the ranch." Everyone raised theirs. Cole looked at Eleanor across the table. She looked back. "To the ranch?" Yes, that was right. The home she had built here was inseparable from the work, from the people at this table, from the valley outside the window and the garlic in the ground and the sourdough working in its jar. It was all of a piece. For the first time in her life, so was she. Spring arrived in the arguing way of mountain springs. Not gently, not all at once, but in the retreating and advancing manner of a season that hasn't quite committed yet. The snow came off the high meadows in stages, the ground went through its difficult in-between phase, and the cattle that had been in the barn through the worst months came out into the pale March light with the slightly resentful air of animals who had not forgiven the season for what it had put them through. The garlic came up on a Thursday, small and green and improbably certain, pushing through ground that still had frost at depth. Eleanor stood in the kitchen garden and looked at the shoots for a long time. She was not a sentimental woman. The garlic had come up because garlic is built to come up, because she had put it in correctly, at the right depth, in adequately amended soil. There was no mystery in it, but there was something true in it, and the truth was not small. She had planted this in October, in cold ground, in a garden that was a ruin when she arrived, on a ranch that was barely holding, in a valley that had not yet decided what to make of her. And here it was. She went inside and wrote in the notebook. The garlic came up. Then she started breakfast. Mabel Croft's Community Stores program launched in April, 6 weeks after the pass fully opened. Eleanor had built the system through the winter, the accounting, the storage agreements with 4 families, the contribution schedule from 12 participating households, the distribution criteria. She had also built in adjustment margins, because she understood that rigid plans break and flexible ones bend, and that the difference between the two is the difference between a system that survives its first contact with reality and one that doesn't. The first month had 3 problems she hadn't anticipated. One contributing family had a difficult birth in March and came up short on their commitment. Eleanor covered it from the adjustment margin without announcing it. A storage arrangement fell through when a family relocated unexpectedly, requiring emergency renegotiation. And the distribution criteria ran headlong into a conflict between 2 families with a long history of it, both needing allocation in the same week. That last one she solved by sending Hatch with each family's allocation on separate days. Hatch had the particular gift of delivering things without provoking anyone, moving through social friction the way water moves through tight spaces. Not by force, but by patience and persistence. "You're using me as a diplomat," he said. "I'm using you as a person people don't want to argue with," Eleanor said. "That's a different skill." Hatch considered this with the brief, thorough attention he gave to most things. "Fair enough," he said, and went. Mabel reviewed the weekly reports with the focused satisfaction of someone watching a theory confirmed. On the 4th Thursday, she looked up from the accounts with an expression that was as close to surprised as Mabel Croft ever got. "You adjusted the Pierce allocation without marking it as an adjustment," she said. "I covered it from the margin." "Why no notation?" "Because if Ida Pierce knew she'd received an adjusted allocation, she'd have refused it," Eleanor said. "She'd have gone without before she accepted what she'd consider charity." Mabel set the papers down. "Eleanor, in 9 years of organizing this community, I have never once structured a mechanism to protect the dignity of the recipient to the point where they don't know they're receiving help." She said it without false modesty. Mabel Croft did not do false modesty, but with the genuine acknowledgement of someone recognizing a gap in their own thinking. That's not administration. That's understanding people. "It's what I'd want," Eleanor said, "if I were Ida Pierce." Mabel looked at her for a moment. "Next year I want to expand it. 8 more families. We'll need additional storage and a revised contribution scale. I know, plan for September. Mabel picked up her mending. And for what it's worth, this valley is better for you being in it. Eleanor drove home through the April afternoon and thought about that sentence the whole way, not with the deflecting instinct that had been her first response to anything that sounded like praise, the reflex of a woman who had learned that good things said about you in one breath were often taken back in the next. She thought about it plainly, turning it over, examining whether it was true. She thought it might be. The ranch was in its spring rhythm when she pulled in. Cole in the north meadow with the herd, Red and Pete working on the east fence line, Eric doing whatever Eric did with the horses that no one else could quite replicate. The ordinary machinery of a working ranch in a season of starting over. Cole came in at 5 with mud on his boots, and the particular tiredness of a man who has done a full day's physical work in cold air, and Eleanor had coffee on and the beginnings of supper going, and he came into the kitchen and stopped. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the expression she had long since stopped cataloging and simply accepted as the way he looked at her now, direct and without reserve, the face of a man who has finished being careful about something he is certain of. "Good day?" she asked. "Average day," he said. "Good evening." He poured his coffee and leaned against the counter near the range, close enough to talk, and they talked while she cooked. About the herd, about a fence section that needed replacing before summer, about a letter from a Denver supplier offering better winter feed prices if they committed to volume in advance. Practical things, the texture of a shared life, conversation that had no performance in it because there was no longer any audience to perform for. At some point, Cole said, quietly, almost to his coffee cup, "Weller stopped me in the East Meadow today, asked me to thank you again, said his wife still talks about the storm night. She was perfectly capable of managing without me," Eleanor said. "Eleanor." She turned. "Let it land," he said. "Just once. Let it land without redirecting it." She looked at him. He was watching her with the patient, clear-eyed attention of a man who has been learning the particular geography of another person and has identified the place where the wall is thinnest. "All right," she said. "All right." "It lands?" she said. "I'm letting it land." Something in his face softened. "Good." She turned back to the range. The beans were at the right temperature, the bread was 10 minutes from done, the kitchen smelled like a room that was properly in use. Outside the window, the last of the day's light was doing the thing it did in spring, touching the ridge above the east meadow and turning it amber before it went. "May Darrow asked about you today," Cole said. "In town." "Asked what?" "Asked if you'd come to her garden planning meeting next month. She's doing something with the women of the valley, a seed exchange program." He set his cup down. "She said you'd understand what she meant." Eleanor thought about May Darrow in a doorway saying, "I owe you an apology," and May Darrow folding bedding for 2 hours after the storm, and May Darrow's casserole with her mother's Missouri recipe. People were not the first version of themselves they showed you. That was something she had always known intellectually and was still, at 31, learning to trust in practice. "Tell her yes," Eleanor said. Red came in for supper with the report that Pete had bent a fence post in a way that suggested either spectacular clumsiness or an altercation with a cow, and the table had the noise and mild argument of people who work together and have stopped being careful around each other. Hatch drank his coffee with the settled air of a man who has watched something come together that he wasn't certain would. Eric ate efficiently and said 3 words across the entire meal, which was above his average. After supper, after the kitchen was cleaned and the ranch had settled into its evening, Eleanor went upstairs and opened the notebook. She had written 43 entries since December. Not all of them were significant. Some were practical. A technique for extending the life of root vegetables in cold storage, the correct ratio for the sourdough, the names of the 12 families in Mabel's program and their specific circumstances. Some were observations about the valley, about the way certain weather moved through the mountains, about what the land looked like at different times of day and different seasons. Some were harder to categorize. She turned to a fresh page and wrote, "A woman in my position. That is what I called myself when I arrived, as though my position were fixed, as though I had come here already determined rather than in the process of becoming." She paused. The lamp threw warm light across the page. "The position changes. That is the thing nobody told me, maybe because nobody could. You have to arrive at the place where it's changing before you can see that it changes at all. and by then you have already done the work, which is the only way the changing happens. She stopped writing, not because she had run out of things to say, but because some things are true whether or not you write them down, and she had spent enough of her life keeping careful records of what she stood to lose that it was time to stop and simply inhabit what she had. She capped the pen and closed the notebook and sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet house, listening to the ordinary sounds of the ranch at night. The distant settling of the barn, the horses' shifting weight, the wind in the pines on the hillside above the east pasture. Cole knocked on the open bedroom door, a habit he'd kept, not because she'd asked for it, but because he was, in the specific way of decent men, respectful of the difference between a shared life and an assumed one. "Light's still on," he said. "I was writing." He looked at the notebook on the table. He had never asked about it, which was one of the things she trusted about him, that he understood the difference between being interested and being entitled to something. "Come down when you're ready," he said. "I put more wood on." She looked at him in the doorway, this man who had met her with disappointment and sat across from her at enough kitchen tables to build something neither of them had planned, and felt the particular weight of a life that had arrived at somewhere real. "I'll be down," she said. He went. She heard his boots on the stairs, the creak of the third step, the sound of him settling into the chair by the range that had become his evening chair, the way the kitchen table had become their table, the way this house had become, without announcement or ceremony, their house. She stood and went to the window. The valley was dark below the mountains, the sky above them enormous and clear and full of stars in the way it only gets at altitude, far from anything that makes competing light. The snow was gone from the lower meadows, and the creek was running high with melt, and in the kitchen garden below the window, she knew without seeing it that the garlic was 8 inches tall, and the peas were climbing their stakes, and the ground that had been a ruin in October was doing what good ground does when it's worked correctly. She had not transformed this place. She had not arrived with anything extraordinary. She had arrived with capable hands and the willingness to use them, and with a particular stubbornness, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet, durable, unremarkable stubbornness of a person who decides that leaving is not the answer and then does not leave. That was all, and that had been enough. She had learned in 31 years of rooms that weren't hers and tables she would eventually leave that the world makes a specific and continuous case for smallness. It tells you, in dozens of ways that have nothing to do with words, that people in your position should expect less, want less, take up less space, make themselves easier to overlook so that being overlooked hurts less. She had believed it for a long time. She did not believe it anymore. Not because someone had convinced her otherwise, not because a man had seen her value or a community had recognized her worth. Those things had happened and they mattered, but they were not the reason. The reason was simpler and harder than that. The reason was that she had stayed long enough in one place to see what she was actually capable of, and what she was capable of was not small. And once you have seen that clearly, it becomes very difficult to unsee it. She thought about the young woman she had been at 15, carrying a basket up someone else's stairs for the first time, learning to be invisible. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in October with a worn carpet bag and a face arranged to expect nothing. She thought about the garlic in the ground. Then she went downstairs to where the fire was burning and Cole was in his chair and the kitchen smelled like bread and everything in it was hers, and she sat down across from him, and the night settled around the ranch the way nights settle around places that have someone in them, completely, warmly, without apology. Outside, the stars were extraordinary. Inside, 2 imperfect people sat by a fire they had built together, in a house they were still learning to share, in a valley that had not made anything easy and had given them, in return for that difficulty, something that could not have been built any other way. It was not a perfect life. It was a real one. That was the difference, and the difference was everything.